And what we try to do is use linear as prescribed, right? Like linear is designed to solve specific problems. We try to use it more or less to solve the problems it was designed to solve. And anything that's outside of that, if another tool is appropriate, then we'll use that other tool in conjunction with linear. Because I think that's like the best simulation of how a real customer would do it, right? No customer is going to be like, I'm going to force fit linear into every single possible use case, even if it's the wrong tool for it. And yeah, so I think what ends up happening when you do that is you become such good power users of your tool that you don't actually even see the pain anymore, right? You don't see the natural contours of when people have to eject from your tool because you're so good at just contorting it to fit every single use case. So that's our philosophy about it, right? Is that like, hey, like when you feel the inkling that this is no longer the right tool, use something else, and then figure out why that other tool is better.
Welcome to another episode of Supra Insider. This time, Mark and I sat down with none other than Nan Yu, who is currently the head of product at Linear. He was also the only product manager at Linear until just recently, as they've scaled to 50 people. Before Linear, Nan was the VP of product at Mode Analytics. He was also the interim CTO there before he became the VP of product. And then before that, he was at Abstract, where I worked with Nan on my team. So I was the product manager for one of our squads. Nan was the engineering manager. We've been friends ever since, and he's been really generous agreeing to come on the pod. And Nan also has a very interesting background before Abstract. He was the CTO at Everlane for over 5 years and started his career as a software engineer at Goldman Sachs. So he's definitely a more technical product manager who fully understands that side of the world. So we had a great conversation.
Yeah, it was a fantastic conversation, and we covered a lot of ground. We started the conversation by talking about org design and the unique way that Linear operates and how they have these fluid teams that ramp up depending on the project or the problem space that they're working on. We also touched on when does design actually matter, especially in the B2B space, and what are some things that Nan does himself to cultivate that good taste as a product leader. We also touched on work trials, which is another thing that is quite unique about Linear. Everyone that joins the company has to go through a work trial and much, much more.
Nan is an incredibly thoughtful and original thinker, and we loved diving into these topics. So we hope you enjoy this conversation. All right, we're live. Welcome to the podcast, Nan.
Really happy to be here, guys.
Mark and I have been really excited to have this conversation. One of the things that we talk about all the time in Supra is how different teams structure themselves. There's a lot of articles floating around there for the ways that different teams like to structure themselves. You and I have spoken quite a bit about some of your hot takes on, things that people do when they build their teams and design their teams. And I think you have different views on some of those. And I would just love to start by getting a sense for how does Linear at its current stage choose to structure its teams, and what do you think is unique about the way that you guys structure your teams relative to the way that some of the other folks in the industry seem to view the best practices of structuring software teams?
At Linear, we structure our teams in a somewhat non-traditional way. We have two teams, one's in the EU and one's in the US. We're a fully distributed company, and the way we structure our teams is basically by geography. And we do that mainly to facilitate like stronger communication more than anything else, right? You have two clusters of time zones where people are able to be awake at the same time and collaborate on the same problems, be in meetings and that kind of stuff. What you usually see with companies, especially the ones that are like about our size, right? Where we broke the 50-person mark on our way to 100. And what you usually see is people tend to like at this point pretty aggressively split their teams into small squads that focus on specific product surfaces. Usually they're structured in like, oh, there's 5 engineers and 1 designer and 1 PM like running the squad, and they're somewhat autonomous. All of the words that people use to describe this, it probably sounds very familiar. And
I'm curious, why do you think people split those teams like so small? Why do you think that happens? Do you think someone just defined this is the way you do it and then everyone follows that? Or do you think there's actually a good reason to do that?
yeah, it's funny because I'm sure there's like a fundamental reason that people do it. But so just to give some context here, before I worked at Linear, between my last 2 full-time roles, I did some consulting work, right? I'm like, hey, I just want to see how like different startups run their teams and maybe help them out, like figuring out like their roadmaps and things like that. And So I worked with a lot of different startups, and all the ones that are about this size, they all did this. And then when I asked like the leaders or the founders, like, wait, why did you choose this particular structure? Their answer, it always traced back to this one blog post that Spotify, some dudes from Spotify wrote like in 2012. And if it's not that original post, it's like it's like Atlassian writing a content marketing piece that references it or something like that. It's like something, right, in that sphere, some derivative of that post. And it's interesting because I don't know if even the folks at Spotify like believe that particular content
Can you
anymore.
clarify what's like the gist of what this post from Spotify is communicating? What's the opinionated stance it's taking on how to build teams that you are watching people apply and not even maybe critically think about it too much before they do?
Yeah, it basically really advocates for this very small, like tactical squads that try to attack specific surface areas of the product. And there's even like a diagram where they like have the Spotify homepage and they're like, this rectangle is this squad and this rectangle is this other squad. And they slice up the homepage into 5 different surfaces that these squads all kind of focus on. And then these companies that I saw doing this, they weren't in the same industry, right? They're not like a content streaming company or anything like that. It's not like they have the same business structure. But it's when they Google for like, how should I do this? How should I scale up my like agile processes or something? It's the only thing that's on the internet. And so there's like this availability bias, right? That ends up happening when
Totally.
people end up doing this. And then almost all of them, like one of the first things that I would do is I work with the founders and I'll be like, okay, what do you want from your team? And they're like, well, we want more focus. We're in a place where it just feels like somehow we added a bunch of people and we got slower, right? This is the thing you hear from founders all the time. Hey, we grew our team, we're spending more money now, and somehow we're slower. And I'm like, okay. And then, so you want more focus. But the way they structure their team is like, hey, I have 5 evenly distributed teams that all focus on different things, right? So by definition, you're not going to get focused. You're doing 5 things at once as a baseline. So what they end up doing is they end up force fitting, they'll like set up OKRs or some other goal setting, and they're like force fit everyone's OKRs into the thing that they actually want to happen. But now they're just shadow boxing at it, right? They're not really even just saying directly, hey, work on this thing. This is the most important thing in the company, work on this thing. They're saying like, oh no, well, because your team's mandate is X and then we're doing this thing, then this is how you contribute to this thing. And there's like 2 different indirections to get to actually focusing on the task at hand.
And
Yeah.
you've used this example that in that structure, what could happen is some team could be responsible for some kind of like enterprise permissions, like settings page, and they make it super sick. Like it's incredible. It's the best enterprise control settings page in the world. But what's the point? What's the business value of doing that, right?
Right, exactly, right? You see some of these products and you'll click around on it. You're like, okay, well, the main thing that you do is this, but this like side feature or the admin management panel, like you're alluding to, just is extremely overdeveloped, right? It has every bell and whistle in. And like, why? I was like, well, someone thought it was their job, right? Some PM thought it was their job to make this thing the best version of this thing possible. The team said, hey, it's our mandate to work on the admin side of the world. So that's what we're going to do. And they did their job, right? Everyone did the goal that they set out to do, except the goal was the wrong goal in the first place. And all of that kind of, if you trace it all the way back, right, where it comes down to is someone decided to split the team into these 5 different focus areas where really your company has 1 or 2 focus areas, right? If you were going to say like, hey, how do I map like my personnel and my effort, right, at the organization to what's actually important, you wouldn't say do it across 5 evenly split ideas, right? That's a recipe for going nowhere. So I think that's what ends up happening, right? Is that you start off, you're a small team, you don't get to have you don't get to do 5 things, right? You have a single checklist. You're like, we're going to do this thing fully stack rank 1 at a time, and then you grow and you add more people, and then all of a sudden you're doing 5 things at once. And then you ask yourself like, how is it that we have 5 times the amount of people, but we're not going any faster? And that's usually what ends up happening.
Yeah. It's surprising to me that there's no more content out there to solve this problem, given that world that you just described. It's definitely very far from ideal, right? I think like another problem that I've seen when you have too many teams is that it's really hard to collaborate or to get the things that are in the middle that don't fall like squarely into any of the mandates, right? If there's something that you need collaboration with 2 teams, like that collaboration across those 2 squads is a nightmare. It's a lot slower than if you had one team that had to get that done. Or even if you have very ambitious PMs, right, running those squads, like then you can get a little of like a resource fight of like, hey, how do I get more funding for my thing? Because I want to drive my outcome. But then maybe that outcome that you're running might not be the most important. So I totally agree. And yeah, I'm curious, why do you think there's no more content around org design out there other than the Spotify model, team topologies, which seem to be like the links that everyone shares? Like at Supra, when someone's like, hey, how should I design my org? Everyone's like, oh, like you need to read this book, Team Topologies, which is good for some companies, but I think it's, as you said, far from ideal.
Yeah. Well, why isn't there more content out there? Because it's very hard to write content that sounds very simple, right? It's like, what are the one or two things that differentiate your company? Do that stuff really hard, right? That's it. That's all there is. So if that means figuring out every possible way to concentrate your talent and your effort on those things that differentiate your product, then you should do that. There's no fancy mechanism to think about. Like at that point, you're done. You're like, okay, great. So what are the things you want to do? We want to work on these projects or achieve these goals or whatever it is. Okay, cool. Staff them up before you do anything else. And if you have anyone left over, you can think about your secondary goals and things like that if you can't productively add more people to the main thing. And one last thing. Yeah. It's when people ask for like investing advice, the best investing advice is like buy index funds and deal with it. And that's it, right? You're done, right? Buy index funds, let it grow over time. Don't do anything fancy. Don't day trade. Don't do anything. Don't overcomplicate things. And I think that it's always the same thing. You can't write a book that says buy index funds, end of story. Sorry, go for it, Ben.
No, I think I agree with you. I think that what I was trying to think through is if there was like a blog post or like a one pager on just like how to do things differently, what would go into it when it comes to structuring teams. What I'm hearing is something maybe in the spirit of like the whole company should have like one list of priorities almost, and everything that you staff should come from that list, and no, there shouldn't be bubbles where items 15 through 20 on that list feel like the most important thing in the company to anybody.
Yeah, and there is like keeping the lights on type of work, right? You have to obviously maintain like a certain level of technical quality and fix bugs and things like that. And it's useful to solve those things tactically, specifically. But then there's a lot of things that are like secondary features, right? Like we talk about like admin interfaces and integrations and things like that. And you got to be really careful, right? Because the moment you spin up an integrations team, you have 100 integrations that no one uses. So you got to be really careful when you go down those paths and make decisions, right? That's why you have product managers to make these sort of trade-offs and to decide when we have the first 10 integrations, are we just done? Like, I know that we can do integration number 11, but we don't need to. We can just leave it there for 2 years and not touch it again. And that's that path. That's the sort of secret path that you don't get to take, right? If you spin up a bunch of specialized teams that handle all these different surfaces, you don't get to say, hey, this surface is done. Because, I mean, you can, but it feels like a reorg at that point. And there's a lot of like institutional inertia and friction that ends up happening that prevents you from wanting to do that. So that's how we think about it, right, at Linear, is that we have two sort of blobs, right? They're teams, but they're like blobs. And when we want to staff up a project, we pull like the right people from one of the blobs and say like, okay, great, these are the right people to work on this project. Here's the goal that we're trying to get to. Here's like the sort of customer experience we're trying to get to. Okay, let's do it. And then when we're done with that, right, when we get to that point, we can reevaluate whether or not we want to invest any further.
So I want to follow up on that. Are the people, you don't have to tell us like a specific project, but if you're willing to share, I'm curious what almost like the timeline of bringing these people together. Is every person at Linear always working on at least one project and one's about to finish and another one's about to kick off? Are people balancing multiple projects at a given time in potentially different areas? Like, how does this play out in practice?
So usually people have one main thing they're focusing on. And that main thing could be like a particular project or initiative that we're working on. It could also be, hey, you just finished something. Like your main thing should be just fixing bugs and chilling for a while, right? We don't want 100% utilization on these roadmap items. If you do that, you don't leave any space to respond to a customer that needs a feature to be like tweaked a little bit, or just like a really gnarly bug fix that someone needs to dive into or something like that, right? You have to have bandwidth for those things. So, but when something is your main thing, it's your main thing. And when you're in between projects, you'll have a lot of bandwidth to work on your personal backlog and make sure that you're able to kind of pay back debt and all that stuff.
And how do you know if a project is done and that it's time to break that team apart?
So I think we always go into it with some semblance of a guess, right? We generally don't go into a project without any idea of what the about what the exit strategy is. And but of course, like you finish the first iteration, and then you always have a choice about like, do we further invest in this thing? And there's a few different sorts of like litmus tests that we have, right? Like ultimately, what we want to do is say like, hey, we're comfortable kind of leaving this feature alone for 12 to 18 months, right? We want to get to that point where we're like, reports will come in, people will ask for feature updates and changes and things like that. But we should be comfortable just saying, okay, we hear you, we're going to put it on our backlog and just like not move on it really for like about a year. But in order to get to that point, you have to go through a process of, okay, like put a first version out, get a bunch of beta testers, see what really works and what doesn't. Are there any assumptions that we missed? Right. So there's a lot of like validation that you have to do, but ultimately we're trying to drive towards that goal.
When you kick off a project like the project's overhaul that you guys announced yesterday, when you started, do you guys try to set like deadlines or like almost like when's the first milestone supposed to be done? Like we're willing to fund this for 3 months, but not 6. Do you make any of those types of calculations up front?
We put rough dates on things, and I think this, funny enough, it's one of the points of this release we just made, which is like you're a PM or any other person that's in charge of planning, and at the beginning of a project, you have an idea about what the customer outcomes are, right? Like you haven't done the design yet, you haven't tried to write any of the code, but you have an idea about what kind of problems you want to solve for the customer, how you want them to feel on the other side of it, so you actually know a little bit about the marketing, but you're not very precise about the dates. So for us, we're like, hey, like we would love to land something like the first quarter of this year. And we missed it. In all honesty, we missed it. We got to beta, right? This is one of those things that we just talked about. We're like, hey, we got to beta. And it took us a while to like nail down the functionality and make sure that all of the sort of ergonomics around the product and the UI surface was good. And for this particular project, I think one of the reasons we missed it is we didn't think the UX was correct yet, right? There's some aspects of the UX where like during our beta process, we really proved out the value, right? We used it internally for ages. Our beta testers who we handheld through adopting it, they got a lot of value out of it. And everyone was like, this is a great feature. But the first time user experience just wasn't honed in yet. We hadn't solved it. So then we decided that, hey, we're gonna extend this by a little bit and really solve that, kind of going from completely empty state to like fully populated project, right? That part of the user journey we wanted to really nail down.
Yeah. And something that maybe would be very helpful to go through is like, maybe we want to follow that specific example. Can you walk us through the moment that you realize, hey, there's a problem in the way our current projects work, or here's a struggle that our customers are dealing with, to the point that you start to think, cool, yeah, I agree. I think this is a problem. Now let's start to find who are the right people in Linear to solve for that problem. Walk us through, how do you think about that as the head of product?
Yeah. So I think it probably bears some explanation of what Linear actually is to contextualize this. We are a tool that software development teams use to plan and build and track their development work, right? So what people typically do is they have some combination of an issue tracker, some documentation system, and some spreadsheets, right? And something that looks like that. And then they mix it all together and they stitch it all together to facilitate the full kind of software development lifecycle. And what we want to do is build an integrated system that handles that end to end. So what we found was, when we set out to solve this problem, right, we found that people were our customers. When we talked to them, they were all doing this pattern where they would do a lot of their initial idea sketching inside of a document system like Google Docs or something. And then once it got to like, okay, engineers can start writing code against this, then they would move it into Linear. Right. And then they would move it into Linear as a project, and then they would start writing code against it. That's the moment that things like moved into Linear. And for us, we're like, it's interesting that they waited so long to do that. But also, once you start developing this stuff, like that documentation is now extremely out of date, right? It has no idea that work is started. It has, if something changes on the requirement side as you're discovering how to implement this, it takes a lot of diligence to go back into those docs and update those things. So what we wanted to do was bring it all together in one place, so that for us, that projects can start within Linear the moment that someone has an idea, and develop it on the research side within Linear, and then smoothly transition into implementation and release. Right. So that was the change, right, in the product, and it all stemmed from us noticing this sort of customer behavior.
Yeah. So basically, kind of getting rid of that Google Doc that goes stale after people have reviewed the PRD or whatever.
Yeah, exactly. It's like it's one of these things where there's two problems, right? It's like one, it goes stale immediately, like you said. But then usually with Google Docs, like there's probably 4 or 5 different versions, right? That you made some revisions and some are temporary, and then you search for it, and then you see 4 results come up, and you're like, I have no idea which one of these I'm supposed to look at. So we wanted to solve that problem too, about giving some authority to like this is the actual sort of provenance of how we got to this decision in the first place.
So given that, like we talked earlier, there's no one at Linear who's the person for projects because you guys don't structure permanent teams that are based on features. So when a feature or problem like this comes up, that's going to require someone to go very deep into something like an overhaul of the projects as like a space in the product. It sounds like your menu of options starts with thinking about which of the blobs maybe to tap into. Like, do you want this to be like a Europe blob or a US blob staffing, right? Because you guys don't staff you wouldn't staff a project like this with like a cross-functional blob of like engineers in Europe and designers in the US, right? You guys avoid doing stuff like that?
Yeah, we generally try to avoid that. Again, the teams are set up in a way where, it's to really facilitate high bandwidth communication. But yes, in this case, we chose Europe. A lot of the members of the EU team had thought about similar problems like this before. Our lead designer is in Europe, and we're like, this is an important surface. We're going to give it to the person who's got the deepest experience, the best knowledge of the system, things like that. And I think that even that decision, right, it's a decision that we get to make. That this is a super important initiative for us. So we should try to get the best talent on the team for this particular job. Right. So we have some other designers in the US, but they started more recently. They don't really understand how the system necessarily works. They don't have the reps quite yet. And we knew this was going to reach pretty deep into a lot of different subsystems. So we wanted someone who really knew how things were working to work on this particular problem.
And does someone who is tapped to work on this project from the European blob, do they get to be like raising their hands and being like, hey, like I would love to work on this? Or do you guys have more of like, hey, we want you to work on this? Is it like more top down, like almost like appointment to projects? Or is it like, I've been on some teams that are a little bit more democratic where there's like some projects and you ask like, hey, who's interested in working on what? I'm just curious the degree to which you guys try to get input from the team for what they would like to work on.
We try to at least give people some input, right? We try to be accommodating. At any moment, there are 2 or 3 things that we're going to be working on. And if someone really likes or dislikes a particular thing, we try to accommodate that preference.
Do you set a limit of how many problems the company's tackling all at once? Because like, going back to the original question of like, we don't want to be working on too many problems because then that adds too many priorities. And even for you, for a while, you were the head of product, solo PM. So like, how do you think about like the number of customer problems that you're solving all at once?
So I think the number of problems that we're trying to solve at once is typically very small, depending on how you're counting. Right? Like right now, our main focus is on like Linear, I said, was a tool for planning and building software. And it's the planning side that we're really focusing on right now. So it's more of like a PM or a TPM type of user persona. It's about all the things that happen before the first issue is created, right? So after the first issue is created, then that's in the building stage. Like that is not what we're thinking of right now, right? We're thinking of all the things that happen before that. So it's typically at a higher level of organization, right? It's for users who don't even really look at issues typically. Like as a PM, I don't really look at issues, right? I think about timelines, I think about projects, I think about like user requirements. But when it comes down to cutting individual issues, usually that's in the realm of engineering managers and such. So it's for a very specific like part of the product portfolio, right, that we're trying to solve for. Now, that's still a pretty big surface. So we have a plan of attack where there's multiple projects happening that are all coming together to solve that problem. So I think it really depends on how you split it. But yes, thematically, we are focused on very specific things, but that surface area might be wide enough where there's multiple projects trying to do something about it.
Yeah, I'm curious. I was recently listening to a conversation with some folks from Figma, and they talk about how they use Figma on steroids. Like they use FigJam on steroids, they use Figma on steroids as they're the power users. Do you guys stretch the limits of how Linear could be used to plan work in its current form to like really feel the pain of where it's falling short when you're trying to figure out how to improve the product to be better for planning?
So I think if I had to give a one-word answer, it would be no. And what we try to do is use linear as prescribed, right? Like linear is designed to solve specific problems. We try to use it more or less to solve the problems it was designed to solve. And anything that's outside of that, if another tool is appropriate, then we'll use that other tool in conjunction with linear. Because I think that's like the best simulation of how a real customer would do it, right? No customer is going to be like, I'm going to force fit linear into every single possible use case, even if it's the wrong tool for it. And yeah, so I think what ends up happening when you do that is you become such good power users of your tool that you don't actually even see the pain anymore, right? You don't see the natural contours of when people have to eject from your tool because you're so good at just contorting it to fit every single use case. So that's our philosophy about it, right? Is that like, hey, like when you feel the inkling that this is no longer the right tool, use something else, and then figure out why that other tool is better.
So just curious, which tool are you going to cut out of your workflow now that you guys have launched the project's overhaul? Like, was there a tool that you guys are just going to stop using now because you're bringing it into the fold?
Yeah, we were using various documentation systems and various spreadsheets to solve for planning, project PRDs, research documents, meeting notes, like all that kind of stuff, right? Anything that has to do where like this thing is ostensibly about a particular project, we're now hanging it right off the project inside of Linear. So that wasn't the case. That wasn't the case before we had this feature. We weren't trying to force the older version of projects into this form.
I love how prescriptive and opinionated Linear is. I think that's refreshing, and I can imagine as a new user using the product, it's nice to not have to make choices. Linear has already made the choices for me. But I guess on the flip side, something that I would worry is that, am I limiting the TAM of Linear by being very prescriptive, especially if I want to get adoption at bigger companies that have a very clear culture, a very clear way of doing work? Like, how do you think about that?
I think our TAM is really about software development teams. And I think regardless of whether or not we take a very loose, like highly customizable approach or a sort of more prescriptive, more opinionated approach, it's still the same TAM. But the motion into the market is very different. Because if we're going to be all about saying yes to every single feature request and being super highly customizable, then that's part of like, honestly, like the selling process, right? It's like, hey, like our value prop to you is you get to fit our system into whatever workflow that you prefer. But that also precludes that customer has a strong opinion about what workflow they should be using, right? It's so strong that they prefer the sort of customizability aspect of it. But another way into the same market is to say like, look, I know you have your opinions and here's ours. And I think what you should do is actually standardize on the motions that Linear lets you take, right? There's sort of default easy things to do within Linear that put you on like rails. Like you get on the rails, like all the things go super smooth, all the workflows are automated. And then after that, you can take your mental bandwidth and energy that you were using to customize your ticketing system, right? Take that and focus it on your actual job, right? Which is to develop an excellent piece of software for your customers, right? Like that's where your creativity and your thinking should go. It shouldn't go to like customizing your tools. So just do the thing that Linear really makes super smooth, low friction, and then go and focus on doing your job. And then it's that simple.
At a hypothetical level, I agree, but I'm also putting myself in the shoes of, let's put Google as an example, right? Let's say Google wants to adopt Linear and I'm the head of IT, whatever. I'm like, I love the sound of that, but also I'm extremely, scared and anxious about having to fight this fight internally of like thousands of engineers be like, hey, I know you work this way, but we need to change the way we do things, and we're going to be adopting this tool. Like, yeah, I don't know how. It seems like there has to be one champion, I guess, internally that has to take that kind of fight internally. Otherwise, it seems like a tough thing to do.
I think with any kind of B2B sales, especially when you go up market, you're gonna need champions helping you land a beachhead and convince the internal stakeholders and doing all that good stuff. to be successful there, you have to either you're gonna be playing one of two games or maybe like a combination of them. Right, one game is like defending against objections, and that's what you're talking about, which is like the engineering manager says, well, we do it this way. We have to have this exact field to support this particular report that I run. So without that, I veto the process. Right, that's defending against objections. And then there's another thing which is like demonstrating value. And we really feel that if we can do a good job of demonstrating value, that the objections all of a sudden just don't matter. Because if you're an engineering manager and your job is to deliver high quality software rapidly, and we enable you to do, that's the thing that gets you promoted, right? The specific process that you run your team with, your boss doesn't care. Like your boss's boss surely doesn't care, right? What they do care is, did we ship our product on time? Did we ship it in a way that matters to our customers? Or were we efficient about it? Does everyone know what's going on? And I think if we can deliver that promise and that kind of value, then the specifics around what the buttons are don't really matter to people.
Yeah, so if my team is maybe not Google, but because I'm sure they have their in-house tools at this point, but if I was running Jira and we have 500 engineers and someone wants to champion a migration to linear, there's got to be some story, some ROI story for why that's a good use of time, right? What are you finding to be the most effective or most compelling story when trying to build up that internal momentum to make such a dramatic switch between tools that are like, it's very hard to rip out Jira. I've been on teams that are thinking about ripping it out, and it's just like Slack. It's got some like real stickiness to it sometimes. So what do you find to be like the story that overcomes that resistance?
I think with Jira and other more enterprisey incumbent types of products, the main advantage that we have is engagement amongst actual IC developers, right? The people who basically have to take the most number of actions in the tool in the first place, like they are the ones that are our biggest advocates. And the way that sort of plays out is, if you're like a middle manager, right? Like your choice of tool is a big part of your decision making. Is, can I pull the reports that I need out of this, right? I need to understand, are people doing the work we hope that they're doing? Are they doing it at the right pace? All that kind of stuff. But in order to pull a report out of the system, the data quality has got to be very good, right? It's got to be densely populated. There can't be a ton of work happening out of band that's not in the tracking system. If that's happening, then your report's useless. And it has to be there, and it also has to be accurate, right? If people just never update any of their issues, right, it always stays in like the to-do column, and then until all of a sudden it's in production. They're like, wait, what happened to all of the review steps and all that kind of stuff in between? It's like, oh yeah, we don't touch the system. It's too painful. Like, then your reports are also useless. So what we can help them with is saying like, hey, look, we can demonstrate that if by using linear, your ICs, your engineers and designers, like on the ground, they're going to be super engaged, right? They're going to love using the tool. They're going to love living in it. And that means that the data will be available and it'll be high quality. So it doesn't matter if you can get a very specific, super customized report out of this other system. The data is nonsense to begin with, right? It's garbage in, garbage out. So you might have a simpler report out of linear because we're like, look, you should probably keep things simple, but the data is going to be really good and it's going to represent actually what's happening on the ground.
The idea of reporting on what happens in Jira and reporting on what happens in project management tools and burn down charts and like velocity tracking and the whole exercise of assigning story points to things and trying to figure out like how fast the team can move. Like, do you guys do that stuff? Do you assign points to like stories or features? Do you follow those kind of typical processes? Do you look at burn down charts at Linear just to see what the velocity is of the team?
So we don't look at burn down charts, at least not on a regular basis. And some of the other practices that you talked about, do we estimates? Do we run like sprints and those kinds of things? Like my one word answer is sometimes. There are moments where we're like, look, there's this one feature that we have to deliver, and and it's really critical for us to do it, right? Like a big, huge deal. It matters for this. This is strategic for us. So it's not like we're doing things just for this one customer. So we should do it, and time really matters. And in that case, yeah, we do like stand-ups for that, right? We do like estimation. So we like try to figure out like what are the things we can deliver now versus later, and what do we cut, and, prioritize and all that kind of stuff, right? So we're very precise about the blocking and tackling for those kinds of situations. But for something that's more exploratory, all that ritual doesn't really help you, right? Because what we're trying to do is find the right thing to like that customers like respond to. And that means like getting little experiments out the beta and trying to play with stuff internally and just getting in people's hands and getting a lot of qualitative input. All of the rituals involved don't really help you do that kind of stuff. It's more like a research project. So it really depends on the situation.
So every time you guys form a team to like focus on a project, does that team actually get its own autonomy to decide what rituals it wants to follow, what process it wants to follow, or is there still some expected mode of operation to avoid having to revisit that conversation every time a new project kicks off?
Yeah, so we have a default mode, right? So default mode doesn't have any of that stuff, right? We have weekly project syncs where we get together and say like, hey, what's changed, right? What did we learn, right? So from the product perspective, what did we learn about our customers and like their assumptions over the last week? Like, are there any new designs, right? Are there any assumptions that the designs have implicit changes to the product? And then what's the state of the current build? What's in the internal build and what can we play with? Are there any demos we should do? Right. So it's engineering, product design, get together and talk about this stuff at a high level, but it's on a weekly cadence. So that's our normal sort of course of operation. We just did this launch that you alluded to. And over the last about week and a half, like I was hands-on doing daily check-ins. We're like, look, we've been working on this thing for months. We're ready to go. And this is the go live date. If anyone needs to stop the go live process, you better say something right now, right? Like we're T minus 15 days, guys. So let's go. So again, it depends on what mode you're in, like how, what kind of process we need to follow.
I love that. Something that I found really interesting is that in those weekly project things, that one of the main questions we have is like, what have we learned from our customers? I've done a lot of planning meetings for my teams, and it's usually more of like, hey, here's what we're going to do next week. But very rarely you bring in new insights. So love to maybe hear what's an example of like, hey, like here's something that new that we've heard from customers, and therefore here's how we're changing what we're doing next week.
I sometimes it's about what we're changing next week. Sometimes it's about just like, do we need to change any of the assumptions of the project as a whole? And I think that happens all the time, right? Because usually the way it works is we try to like tie it back to people's like actual reactions to things. So maybe we'll like be in a customer call and we'll show them like an interactive demo of something, or even the internal build. I'll just like screen share and like click through on things and show them. And a lot of times, like we want to see people's first reactions. We want to see the first question they ask. They're like, "Oh yeah, can this looks great. Can I do this?" Right? And then you're like, "Can we do this?" And the answer is like, "No, but why do you want to do this?" Right? And then you use that to drill. And then in one of our projects recently, like we've had several customers ask the same question, like, "Can I do this?" And we're like, "We weren't really planning on that, but I think we ought to." And it's one of these things where when you're just thinking about it in a vacuum, you almost offhand dismiss certain ideas. You're like, oh yeah, I don't know, that seems silly, or that's out of
scope.
That can't be high priority. But if it's every customer's first reaction to be like, no, I want X, it's like, okay, great. Now let's at least figure out like why they're all asking that.
And at what point do you bubble up any of those insights or decisions to the CEO? Or those decisions are usually made locally, or there's a certain bar or I guess impact of the decision that needs to be cleared by the CEO or whoever is making the final decision?
So the way we run our development process, we try to be very transparent, right? So that hopefully by default people know what's going on. But I realize that like everyone says that everyone's like, oh, you got to be transparent, and then then people can see things. And I think that transparency isn't enough, right? Because transparency just means like it's discoverable. Like if someone knows what to search for, they'll find it. But who knows what to search for? You got to tell them that this thing even exists in the first place. Otherwise, they're never going to find it. So one of the features that Linear has is in our project management, right, is a thing called project updates. And project updates they're on a cadence, right? For us, again, it's weekly. So after every kind of sync, we get together, we talk about what happened, any kind of major decisions. We write them in the project update and we blast it out to the company. Like, hey, this thing that we're working on, here's some changes that happen. And that gets pretty aggressively federated, right? There's like Slack channels that it gets pushed to. It goes to people's inboxes inside of Linear if they subscribe to the project. So what we try to do is use the system and rely on like, look, if this is something that the CEO, Kari, or one of the other founders is interested in, that it's a button click to subscribe. It's a It's one Slack join to join the right project channel, and they will get all these updates pushed to them. So we don't have to live in this universe where we have to like go get permission for every single change, right? We're like, look, here's our intent. This is what we intend to do, right? Like we got this information from customers. We combine it with these designs. Here's the direction we're taking. Here's the Figma mockup and all that stuff, right? And then if someone has some feelings about it or they want to give feedback, they can just go into Linear and just like write up a comment like right in there, and then we can discuss it from there.
Piggybacking on this, you guys have founder CEO who is a designer by background, and there's not that many companies out there that have that in a founder CEO. And I'm just curious. I mean, Brian Chesky strikes me as another one, right? I'm just curious, like, what you're noticing might be unique about currently working with a founder CEO who's a designer, and how that might influence decision making in a positive, negative, just unique, different kind of way.
Yeah, look, I don't know how much this extrapolates to other sort of design CEOs, design leaders, but working with Kari, I think it's really productive working with him when you talk about the actual product itself, right? Not the idea of the product, not the goal of the product, but like, yeah, how does it actually get rendered into real life? Because at some point you could talk about all the hopes and aspirations that you have, but if you can't actually form it into a workable software concept, then there's almost nothing to talk about. I think Kari is very to the point with that, right? Like working with Kari, it's just like we always try to take it back to the product, and that's when we're, I think, the most productive.
Yeah, I completely agree. I feel like the most productive product reviews that I've had have been when we had a Figma prototype, right? And we've let someone click with it and interact with it, and then just give the feedback that really pushes our design forward. But yeah, I think there's so many companies that spend weeks or months doing user interviews, then sharing, here's what we're hearing, and then here's what we're zeroing in into the persona. So do you guys just skip all of that and then just do it quickly, put a quick prototype, and then if there's questions, you ground them back into those insights? Or do you still do some sort of like, here are the learnings from discovery to the broader company?
We do things like here are the learnings from the discovery, but I think what we try to do is get to working software as fast as we can, because the best kind of feedback for users is you put it in their hands, or at least you're able to demo it to them, and then you get their emotional reaction to what you're showing them. And there are certain things where we're like, oh, this is like similar to what we said before, right? Oh, this is a little nice to have feature that we included in here, and all like, oh yeah, and then you can do this, and you can. For us, it was like when we were doing this projects revamp, and we have this feature where like in the main project documentation, like you're a PM, right? It's like, oh, you're writing some bullet points. We write a lot of bullet points in our lives, and at some point, those bullet points turn into actual requirements. So like, what do? We like create a ticket, copy the bullet point, put it into the ticket, and like add some people, whatever, right? We're like, yeah, but what if you just highlighted the list and just say convert this list, and it just converts it into issues in that project, right? It's just like one click away. You can add a side.
That was one of the coolest parts of your demo, I think. Like the video that you announced, I was like, holy shit. That was one of those like moments of delight that you guys have figured out something that was completely unexpected, that I just was like, that sounds so useful and so magical when it actually works.
Yeah, I'm glad you said, because that's what we heard from customers when we demoed it as well. Like we had no idea that was going to be a thing people latched onto. Like for us, we're like, oh, it's like, hey, like this, one of our engineers, Alex, basically made that in his spare time as like a fun little project, and we're like, this is cool, let's include it, right? Like this is great. And then it's the thing that it's not the main value add of the feature, but it's the hook, right? It's the thing that people see and they go like, oh, you guys have really thought about this.
Yeah, and I feel like the second degree or third degree order effects are amazing too, right? Like now you have this bullet point that's actually not a static text, but it's actually connected to this ticket that if you're curious, like, hey, how is this going? Instead of like trying to find the issue, you just click on it and like, oh, it's right there. So I think it's really awesome that you guys do that. And how often does that happen, that you have a designer or an engineer that on their spare time, they're like, cool, like, I think we need this? Because that sounds amazing. I want to work at a company that has people like that.
It happens pretty often. I think there's a lot of stuff in there where it originated from one of our individual contributors just having a little frustration with the system, or they're like, hey, it would be nice if this happened. Let me prototype it and see what people feel. Again, working software does much more to convince people than words. right? I think one of the disadvantages that we have as PMs is that all we have is words in a lot of circumstances. But our engineers, they're like, hey, I think this would be a cool concept. Let me demo it. And then they'll go into one of our Slack channels and be like, hey, here's a preview link of something I've been working on. What do you guys think? And then a lot of times people are like, oh yeah, ship it. And like, okay, well, it's not ready for that yet, but like, okay, great. We're getting some good internal response. And when that happens, like I try to say like, okay, like what's the best way we can actually incorporate this right into the product? Like when is it ready as is? Are there modifications we need to make? Does it make sense bundled with this other project? Right? There's all those kind of questions about like how do you package this with the product? But we try to be pretty open, right, about this kind of stuff. It's like some of the best ideas happen, with randomly.
I've been on so many teams where there's little moments where we're working on a problem, we're figuring out, fleshing out the solution, and someone has an idea that it's like, oh, this would be really cool, or wouldn't it be awesome if it did this? And oftentimes in some cultures, like there's such a need to like focus on scope and to avoid scope creep and like add things that are not like essential for the thing, that those ideas often just die. They don't get nurtured, they don't get encouraged, they don't get valued, okay, by the teams. What needs to be true about a team for those types of moments to get celebrated, to get valued, and ultimately to become part of the product versus deemed scope creep that's not essential?
It's going to sound, again, too simple, but like taste is a big part of it. Like when people say scope creep, what they don't mean strictly like, oh, the scope increased, therefore it's bad, right? What they say is like the scope increased in a way that's wasteful, therefore it's bad. And whether a small feature addition is wasteful or adds a lot of like magic to the product is that it's a matter of taste. So you also have to commit to taking a little bit of risk. Like maybe you do something and it's like, it doesn't really make sense. We're not going to ship it. Like that happens as often as anything. But I think that when you have a team that generally the taste level is very high, there's a good chance that if someone thinks something's a good idea, that it actually is a good idea. And that when the rest of the team members, including leadership, like when they see it, they recognize it as like, oh yeah, this is a really good idea. I think there's some potential here. Let's figure out how to make this happen.
How do you teach taste to engineers in the team, or is that something that you look for when you're hiring an engineer, that they have that good taste, that good judgment? And maybe even like taking it a step further, like what do you do yourself to keep that product taste high?
It's a very hard question to answer. We do have a pretty rigorous hiring process for this kind of a thing. It's not that we want every engineer to be like an amazing product designer or something. It's more like they have to have some kind of intellectual, like mental kind of concept about why they're making decisions. Like you don't want the decisions to be random, right? They can all be wrong, but if they're all wrong like the same way, then it's like, okay, there's a theory behind this. And I think that's the way that I try to form my own taste, which is like, there's always a reason behind every decision somebody made, right? Like, look, sometimes it could be random, but when you see a product that's like mass manufactured, and you're like, I hate this product, right? It's like, okay, great, pause. That's like interesting, right? Like someone invested a ton of money, like designing this and tooling it and then marketing it, doing whatever. Like, why do you hate it? What is it about this that makes it not for you? Who is it for? Right? Try to work backwards from the reasoning that got this product to where it is. And also for products that you love, right? I love this product. Okay, who would hate this product? Who is this aggressively not for? And I think that if you can do that kind of analysis, that's a pretty good baseline for starting to form your taste. Because like worst case scenario, you can start pattern matching those things into products that you're working on.
Yeah, I think if you're a product builder, whether you're a designer, engineer, PM, who wants to operate in an environment that values taste, how critical do you think it is for like the CEO of that company to be someone who has a strong product taste? Like, well,
it's fully critical. And it's interesting because our CEO Kari, he has a blog post that he wrote a little while back. We did a big redesign, like a visual redesign of the product this year. And one of the things that he wrote, he's like, look, I've never seen a redesign happen without the sort of full commitment from the CEO. Because it's so easy to be like, this is a waste of time, right? This is not going to move any numbers. In fact, it'll make numbers go negative, right? Because people like don't know where the buttons are anymore because you did a redesign, and then everyone like tweets hate messages at you on Twitter because everyone hates every redesign. But you have to like really commit from like the leadership level on down that this is worthwhile. So I think with things like redesigns, with things like these kinds of feature additions, right? You have to have this like commitment starting from the CEO level that we're here to make a really excellent piece of software. In order to do that, we have to commit to like seeing things and being open to new ideas.
I just as we start to wrap up, one thing that we also, I mean, we're switching gears a little bit, but one thing we want to get your thoughts on is Linear's developed a reputation for doing work trials with people. As people could probably imagine if they've made it this far in the conversation, there's a certain type of person that would probably thrive in the Linear environment. And then there's probably another category of person who maybe wouldn't thrive as much because it's an opinionated culture. It's 50 people who have been selected with a very high bar, screening for very specific things. And what it seems to me is that the way that you've been able to pull that off as a company is by doing work trials where you bring people in. Is it 3 to 4 days, something like that?
I think the shortest work trial is probably around 3 days, and then the longest ones are probably around 5 days. So it's 3 to 5 days.
And my understanding is everyone from the most junior person on the team all the way to C-level people that join the leadership team go through that. Is that right?
Yes.
Cool. So my question for you is, Mark and I are always skeptical when people say like every company should do this. So I'm not going to ask you if every company should do work trials, but do you think that there are any things that you could share with someone who's listening if they're a founder or a CEO who's maybe thinking about whether they want to implement work trials at their company? Like what kind of questions would be good to ask themselves to make that kind of decision?
So I think if really pressed, I think that every company that's able to should at least attempt to do work trials. And I think it's not because of any reason other than just humility. I don't think I can ask people questions in 2 hours and get a really good sense of if they're like the right fit to be here for 2 years, right? That's a tiny little sample for what your expected outcome is going to be. So it's just, if you can get the signal from a work trial, you should do it. I realize there's different employment markets that this may or may not be possible, but I also think that even if you think that no one's going to say yes to doing something like this, just ask, just try, and be really generous about it. Right? Like we structure work trials as like contract work, basically. Right? It's not like we pay people a good hourly rate to do this thing. I think for a lot of folks, it's fun. People want to experience like a different company culture. They get to try us out too. Right? Like someone who goes through an interview process takes on a lot of risk in terms of, am I going to commit to this company? They like get to the end of the interview process and they go, well, I've talked to people for about 2 or 3 hours and they gave me an offer. Am I going to do it? Am I going to go quit my job and tell everyone like, hey, I have a new job, and then like risk like it being like exactly the wrong place? There's a lot of risk there too that I think people kind of discount. So it's a lot of de-risking on both sides. And I think one of the things that you might hear from, like, we've all interviewed for jobs before. We've all been successful. We've all been rejected by certain jobs before. And I never want to miss out on an opportunity because I think I wasn't able to show people like my greatest strengths, right? I want people to make a hiring decision about me based on the best that I can do. And I have a much better chance of showing the best I can do over a longer period of time than sitting down in some like high stakes mental battle of wits with a hiring manager.
And I know you just hired a PM, so I don't know if you would feel comfortable like sharing what was their work trial like what was like the assignment you gave them, and as the hiring manager, how were you evaluating them? Was it on a daily basis to check how it was to collaborate with them? Was it based on the outcome that they delivered?
Yeah, we structure our work trials generally to simulate real work as much as possible. So we'll give them a project that's just like a very accelerated version of something they would actually do. So usually it's from our backlog. And we don't expect it to go exactly the same as it would in real life, right? Because of like limited time and things like that. So there's some, level of like incompleteness. It's like the first revision. But yeah, there's pretty frequent check-ins. Again, we're fully remote. So there's a communication sort of pattern that they have to like really adapt to or be comfortable with. We're just on Slack all the time. If you need something, you got to ask for it. No one's ever going to get ignored during their work trial. They're going to be most people's number one priority. Right? If they ask a question, it will get answered like immediately. So I think that's like the commitment that we have during the process. But there's like an official sort of halfway check-in where we'll give one round of feedback. And then part of the evaluation is like, how did they integrate that feedback? Right? Did they take it extremely literally? Did they understand where we were coming from and integrate that into the final work product? Did they ignore it altogether? Did they pick and choose what parts they listen to? There's all sorts of kind of decisions, right, that they get to make for that. So for a PM in this case, they did research on a particular feature that we have in a pipeline. They interviewed like basically members of the Linear team as users. So right, so we put on our ignorant user hat, and then they interviewed us in that way. They collaborated with one of our designers to kind of design some wireframes for that particular feature, and then they presented the PRD to the hiring committee at the end of the work trial. Right, so that was the process.
Is there anything that you think could be different about work trials in the future to make them even more effective if someone wants to use them to hire PMs?
When you say different, you mean what we might try in the future, like a little bit differently?
Yeah, like when I think about the variables, it's like the project you pick, it's the length of the trial, it's the who's on the hiring committee, it's do you have them talk to real customers or do you have them talk to the team putting on their customer hat? Is there any like thing about the work trial that you think would make it even more effective as like a mutual fit finding mechanism?
Yeah, I mean, look, I think with this, we would probably get more benefit out of it if it was longer. Obviously, it's a big ask of people. I think the reason we chose internal users is because obviously scheduling with actual users is a little bit challenging. But honestly, as that pool gets bigger, we might be able to do it. There's just more to sample from. So I mean, there's definitely, and we can definitely be better about picking the right project for people. I think that's something where the first few work trials, that's probably the biggest variance. We've done hundreds of engineering work trials, so we have a pretty good sense of what kinds of projects work really well for it, what are a little bit like awkward to use for a work trial. I think for PMs, it's the first time we hired for this position in this very concentrated manner. So we had to iterate a little bit in terms of what the project was to figure out what works well and what doesn't.
Yeah, I have one last question, then we'll do a couple of wrap-up questions just to close. But the last question I have about this is, since you also use work trials to hire executives, and if someone listening, a lot of the people listening are in the VPs of product, C-level product kind of people, is there anything you've learned about like work trials? Is there any advice you would give on running work trials for really senior people beyond ICPMs, but more like executives?
I think this is more a matter of taste. Like this is the part where, look, I'm not gonna try to tell anyone how to hire their executives, right, in any kind of prescriptive manner. But we tend to look for people who just really love the department, the craft that they're in, right? So when we're hiring for like head of design, we get them to do like actual design work. We like try to make it a very design oriented work trial. It's not exactly the same as what we would give for an IC, but there's definitely a significant overlap. And I think that's something where we put a lot of emphasis on. So I think one of the big failure modes, especially of startup executives, is that you bring someone in and they can't do anything without having a huge team. And then you have, well, do we have the budget for it? Do we like hire a bunch of people? And then you hire a bunch of people and they're not the right executives. And then you're like, and now we're really stuck because we got to switch executives to keep the team. There's all sorts of failure modes there. So I think for startups at least, right, work trials are a really good way to see if executives can go beyond just talking about the thing. Like, can they actually do that? Can your sales executives sell? Because if they can't sell, it's going to be pretty hard for them to be taken seriously by a team of salespeople. And so I think that that's something which we found to be very beneficial.
Cool. Well, I'm sure we could keep going for hours. I really appreciate you coming on. We will have to have you again for part 2 where we can go even deeper. But thank you so much for taking the time. If people want to learn more about you and the work you're doing or anything that you're publishing, where should they go to learn more about you, Nan? And is there anything else they can do to be helpful to you?
Yeah, I'm on X/Twitter as the Nan Yu, TheNanyu. So feel free to say hi to me there. And if you are a user of the product or you just want to try it out and do a free trial, we're always open to product feedback. We have a customer Slack instance that is very active. Like tons of our team members are in there. So if you're already a user and you didn't know about that, please join our Slack community. And then we're always talking shop and figuring out how to make Linear better there as well.
Well, thanks for coming on.
Yeah.
Thanks, Dan.
If you enjoyed this conversation, please share it with someone who you think would benefit from it as well. We really appreciate it. We'd also love a follow or a rating on Substack, Spotify, or YouTube. That's going to let other people find us. And if you have any topic recommendations for a future episode, please send myself or Mark a DM on LinkedIn. We'd love to hear from you. Thanks.